Hello and welcome to part 2 of my 1830 strategy guide. This video is going to cover what I would call the early game of 1830, everything after the initial auction up until the privates are bought in. This is a much broader subject than the initial auction video that I did before. It's much more difficult to generalize a lot of the topics. The initial auction is pretty cut and dry. The thing that you need to understand about the early game of 1830, it is not about running trains. It's basically a dance between 3 or 4 players about who is going to get to buy their privates in first. The train roster is the most important thing that you have to think about when determining how this is going to occur. Mainly the fact that there's 6 2 trains in this game. The game as a whole has one of the easier train rosters to remember. There's 6 2Ts, 5 3Ts, 4 4Ts, 3 5Ts, 2 6Ts, and pretty much unlimited diesels. So what do we have to think about? You have to be able to read the game state and what's going to happen in terms of the players' positions after the initial auction. How many corporations are going to start? How long until a third or a fourth company will start? And additionally, how long until the CNA is bought in, which is pretty important for the mid-game for the southern companies. So if there's a 3-company start, which is probably the most common 1830 start, if the privates are equally distributed, probably 3 players will have enough to start 3 companies. So what does that mean? There's 6 2 trains and 3 companies. So if every company buys one of those 2 trains, that means everyone will be train locked at a train limit of 4 without being able to buy a 3T. So that kind of starts the dance of who's going to be the one to buy a second 2 train to allow people to buy the privates in. So you have to think, do I want to prolong 2T phase, which is what I'll call the initial phase of running trains? Well, the 3 most common companies to start in 1830 in the beginning are most likely C&O, the Ninney, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. The reasons for that is the C&O can run west to Chicago for 7 with 1 2 train, which is the best revenue of all the early companies without spending any money. The Ninney can run for 5, and the PRR runs for 3, but only needs 5 shares to start. So if you want to prolong 2T phase, particularly because you might have the C&O and maybe a pretty decent private, you might be happy to let it ride and buy 2T and see what the other players do. Generally, buying a lot of 2Ts is bad. Once everyone buys in and starts a bunch of companies, more than likely they'll never run again, maybe one more time, because the capital injection from all those new companies, everyone's going to push through those 3s and into the 4s very quickly. So each 2T that you're buying is basically wasted capital, in my opinion. Somebody's got to buy it. There's reasons to, or that we'll talk about later. But the C&O is in a really good position for a prolonged 2T phase. If you want a quick 2T phase, there's reasons why you might want to do this. If you could just buy 2 2Ts and OR1 and then see what everyone else does. Obviously, you don't have control over what everyone else does, but if the other players want a early buy-in, then they're going to have to eat a lot of 2Ts to do it. So if you're the first player in operating order, you can buy 2 2Ts. The second player will most likely only buy 1, and then it'll be on that third player whether they want to buy 3 2Ts and a 3, and then buy their private in. Ideally, if you're doing this, you most likely want it to be the CNA player to have the third company. This means that they only get to have 1 3T, and it limits their buy-in. It's difficult for them to start another company right away uh, because they're only able to buy in for 250 or so. Um, so they're most likely going to have to liquidate most of the shares in the first companies that they bought. And if it happens in OR1, they haven't gotten a dividend either, aside from their one-time payout of the CNA. So they either have to do a full liquidation of their current company, which is potentially suboptimal for someone to scoop up some cheap shares or maybe even take over the presidency of the company. Um, or they're left with investing. And investing, once the first 3T, once the first 3T is purchased, is pretty risky because you know that everyone else is going to be buying in their privates on OR 2.2 and then dumping their shares, and you're going to be last in priority because you're most likely going to be the only one with capital to buy shares. So you will get two payouts of the shares that you're buying, but then you're going to have to take the hit in share value or possible loss in liquidity if the market is full. I wouldn't suggest buying any more than two 2Ts because if you buy three, that could allow two players to buy their privates in, and that may leave you missing the threes altogether and potentially not even running. If two players start companies and start the B&O or additionally, then that's probably likely to happen. So I wouldn't buy three and allow both players to buy in. So that's basically how a traditional three company start will happen. You just have to decide a lot of it based on priority and your position in terms of what privates you have and what you'll be able to do with the money once you buy in. So the other option, or the other most common thing, is a two company start, which will happen one of two ways. It'll be someone is over privatized, winning either the CNA and the DNH, or the CNA and the MNH, or potentially the CNA and any other private, really. And you have to really think about what they've won and how long it'll be until you get a third or a fourth corporation that will get out. Because with two corporations, there's very little risk that the three Ts will be coming until that CNA player starts a corporation. So having the CNO in this situation is really nice because you'll be running for the most, and you'll get to lay a lot of track probably before that third corporation starts. But you really have to be, keeping a close eye on how long it'll be until that player that's over privatized is able to start a company. So, more than likely you'll have an opportunity to have enough track to be running two trains, but you have to be sure that you're not doing this like the OR before the CNA player comes in and weigh and measure whether running that two train will be worth giving the CNA player less 2Ts to have to purchase to get to their private buy-in. So that's the two company start. I think those are the most important things to think about. Is basically just the timing of when those additional companies are going to come in. So some things to think about just in terms of the early game, the initial stock round, par pricing. There's very limited par pricing in 1830, and there's kind of a general consensus that 67 is probably the best value. There's obviously what your par price is, balances your operating order, the company capital that you get, and your personal dividends in terms of how many shares that you're able to buy. Obviously, having more shares in the early game is essential for your success to snowball into later game capital. Generally, the CNA player is going to be the only one that's concerned about company capital in the early game, just because of how big their buy-in is. So if they're forced to buy 3 2Ts, 1 3T, and they do a full buy-in on the CNA, which is $320, that means that they need to have $750 of company capital. So if they want a full buy-in, then they need to par at 76, and that doesn't even leave them any additional money for potential terrain tokens, etc. So it's something to think about. And the other thing to think about in terms of par pricing is if there's companies that are going to be floating, uh, at different points in the game, not just in the initial stock round, it's really important to think about where they will be in terms of when you're starting. Just don't forget that you're going to fall back in OR1, and then if somebody starts in SR2, then their company will actually be ahead of your companies that started in SR or in the initial stock round. So some other things to think about in the initial stock round are, if obviously the CNA player should always have less than $402. So that pretty much eliminates the possibility of starting any other company than the PRR. So, a lot of people will say that getting the PRR or allowing the CNA player to get the PRR is pretty devastatingly bad. I've seen it go both ways, to be honest with you. It's really, like I said, a lot of this early game stuff is very situational. Uh, you give the PRR to someone or you start the PRR yourself. And kind of the double-edged sword of that is that, you know, they can't start a company in the initial stock round, but the next stock round, you're giving them an extra $65 of liquidity. So you do gain a few things out of doing this. You will get an advantage in where you are in your operating order because you'll fall back and then fall down for a sold share. So you can either keep that share paying into the company, or you can buy a cheap share. Um, the reasons that I think that you should probably think about doing this is if you have the M&H and the player with the CNA is going to be giving up priority to you. This is potentially pretty good if they do go for an early buy-in and you also get to buy in. Having the first choice of the next company is pretty solid. The D&H player probably won't have enough money from their buy-in to be able to start another company without totally divesting their entire portfolio, and they might not still have enough after that. So having the first choice of a second corporation because they're giving you priority is pretty good. Some cons to this is it might give the CNA a potential to float the B&O. If they get greater than $400 and they're able to buy 4 shares of the B&O, that's pretty good. That pretty much forces the B&O player to divest the shares that they probably bought in the initial stock round to defend the B&O, because giving the B&O to the CNA player is probably the worst possible scenario in the early game. So that the reason that that's bad, even if the B&O stays in the B&O player's hands, is they're they're not forced to buy a 2T, but falling back and not buying a 2T is pretty suboptimal for them. So more than likely, that's one less 2T that the CNA player is going to have to buy. And it also gives them the potential of starting a better early game company. If they don't start the B&O, and there's only 3 corporations that start and no one's willing to buy that second 2T and give someone the ability to buy in their privates, letting them get the CNO or the NINI over the Pennsylvania Railroad is a pretty big advantage for the CNA player because they're going to be running better revenues and also getting higher private income from their private. So other things to think about. How do you deal with leeches? Leeches are going to be the players that don't have enough money to start a corporation and are going to buy into your company or other companies. And why is this a problem? Well, they're getting free dividends with little to no liability. And you're going to have to deal with the consequences of when they divest and start their own companies. And that's problematic because they're going to fill the market, which is a problem for your later liquidity. And you're going to have a hit to your share value as well. So the few shares that you are able to divest are going to be worth less as well. So how do you, what kind of options do you have against the leeches? Honestly, it's a great thing to have an early company and be in control of the capital, but it does come with this risk. There's two ways that the investors can pretty much play. Um, they can just kind of stamp collect, take one of each company that's starting, and this is probably the only way that you can safely do this every time as an investing player in 1830. If somebody gets greedy and they're not paying attention and they're giving priority to one of the players that they're owning more than two shares of, uh, it's pretty common to get 4 2Ts and a bad tile lay or a bad token, or maybe both, and then you're the president of a broke company with bad prospects and very little money left to buy your private in anyway. So if you're gonna be an investing player, make sure that you're buying shares and not giving priority to someone, or you're just stamp collecting. If somebody does have the ability to buy 4 shares and is forcing you to buy up, to 5 or 6 shares of your company to maintain control, um, then really the only option you have against them at that point is just to hold. This is a pretty difficult road to be on, to be honest with you. I've done it successfully before, but you're pretty much ensuring that you might only get one company the entire game, regardless of what you do. But if someone's going to be filling the market with 4 or 5 of your shares, it's pretty tough to get a company, especially if you only have the D&H. If you have the M&H or the CNA or something like that, then there's a possibility that you might be able to buy in for enough to actually get a second corporation, but it might be the last one available. Yeah, so investing is risky, but potentially devastating for either the owner of the corporation or the person that's doing the investing. So these early companies are going to get sold. So it's better to buy them cheap because the share value drops off pretty heavily, and losing that much money when the dividends aren't very great in the beginning is um, not the way to victory. Another cautionary tale about um, leeching too long. If you're the CNA player and you've paid too much or have 2 privates and you can't start the PRR, don't delay too long because that might give the ability for the B&O player to actually start the Pennsylvania Railroad and maintain control of the B&O, which I've seen before, which turns out to be the worst case scenario for you. So just be cognizant that watching the B&O player's money, if you get a wily B&O player, if they're able to get priority over you and you're trying to just ride the gravy train of early dividends for too long and trying to par the PRR at a higher price than just your initial 67, then you might get nothing. So the early game, floating the B&O, I would never recommend the player that has the B&O private to start the B&O in the twos. Like I said earlier, it can potentially be good for the CNA player to do this if they have enough liquidity after selling a Pennsylvania Railroad share and then floating the B&O and starting their company. It's another train that has to get purchased by not them. But it also carries some inherent risk for the CNA player. If it happens early, it's not as risky. But if the other players have greater than $100 to buy shares, it's a pretty risky thing to be for the CNA player to have to do, because they might lose enough money in doing this if the other players are flipping shares and the share values are dropping, that they might lose the ability to float their company. So just be aware of how much the other players have if you're going to float the B&O and ensure that you're not going to lose more money than you can afford to be able to start your company, because floating another company and then not having any shares to buy is suboptimal. That's probably most of the advice that I have on things to look out for in terms of floating companies and early company choices, stock round things to look out for. Some like operating things. I just want to tell you to be very cautious about what I would consider frivolous spending. The money's very tight in 1830. Bankruptcies are, common enough to talk about them. So, anything like terrain, tokens, upgrading New York City, you really have to think about how much you're going to glean from these things. And upgrading New York Central or New York City is more of a kind of a mid-game thing that we'll talk about, kind of the things that you have to think about with upgrading New York City. But there's terrain around companies that start, and obviously the B&O, if it starts, it's forced to pay terrain. But the Ninny up here, Providence, is kind of a big deal, having to pay $80 for that early. And in terms of laying track, these are probably the 4 most important tiles. I'm not really big on track laying, to be honest with you, but these 4 tiles kind of determine how the map will turn out and which companies will be allowed to be viable in the mid to late game. So I think they do have value in talking about. And I guess we'll talk about the Ninny, the New York New Haven, because they control the fate of the northern companies up here, the New York Central and the Boston and Maine, which are not really companies that you should be starting early for obvious reasons. I'm not going to talk about that here. So the New York New Haven in the early game is going to run for 5 if it only buys 1 train. Has potential to be an excellent mid-game corporation because it's potentially can double tap New York, and if it doesn't even if it doesn't double tap New York, running New York to Providence with 2-3 trains can be very lucrative. One of the better runs of the early game. The most important reason that the Ninny is started early is because it gets control over this New Haven and Hartford tile here. There's pretty much 3 tiles that are viable there, and they all have kind of different ripple effects in the game. I would say the most common one that gets laid here is probably this one in most of the games that we play. This really gives a lot of viability to the New York Central. This is a great one if you're going to have priority and will have the ability to pick the first, second company. Laying this tile and getting the New York Central is amazing. Having the Ninny and the New York Central laying track together. And 3 T's are perfect because it's only 3 stops from New York to Albany. The New York Central is a great mid to late game company. Lots of tokens if it's cooperating with the Ninny. This one also gives some viability to the Boston and Maine. Boston upgrades this tile here. So it does have to pay 120 to get over into here, but if you are controlling the Ninny, it's not terrible getting the Boston and Maine to somewhere. You do have a little more ability to make that happen if you don't have control of the New York New Haven. It's pretty difficult if someone has both the Central and New York New Haven to get the Boston and Maine out of here with this tile laid, though. This is probably the tile that I see most new players lay. New players, a lot of times they see the ability to run 3 trains here, and they're not really heeding my advice of the early game is not about running trains. If you play this tile and buy 3 trains, they might run once. That's just too juicy of a buy-in for everyone else to be passing up on. And, this is 4-player stuff, everything in this video. This might be a little more viable at 6 players, something like that. But This is a killer tile because it really makes the New York Central difficult to navigate here. It pretty much relies on New York to get upgraded, or it's just running this terrible route for 3 here into this dit. This one can also, theoretically, Boston and Maine can come down this way again, just like in the other one that I just showed you. But this one really, if you're going to get your first pick of second companies, this is going to be ensuring that you get the Boston and Maine. Problem is you are going to be paying this $80 for Providence. Sometimes this is decent to lay if you can get some, even if you're not going to get Providence or Boston and Maine, if you can get them to lay Providence for you and you get 2-3 tees, then it's pretty decent, because if someone else is paying for Providence here, that's great. But if you're paying for Providence yourself, like I said, you have to be careful about spending $80 for this and probably $40 for a token. $120 is a lot of money to be throwing away. That's, more than 1/4 of a permanent train, which this game is about permanent trains. And this is the third viable option. This is kind of like the middle of the road, I guess. This one keeps the central viable with the same as the first one, and it also keeps the Boston and Maine viable as well. This is kind of like a happy medium in terms of if you don't really know what your second company is going to be and you want to have something available that's going to be reasonably good. Even if someone takes the central here, you can most likely make the Boston and Maine viable. This one does kind of, again, rely on New York getting upgraded, which is then you're going to be on the hook for another $80 to upgrade New York and an $80 to lay the water in Providence. But it's an option. Additionally, the problem with this is you need to be running a 5 train out of Boston here to actually hit New York. So you're looking at a $80 token, $200 of terrain and tokens to be hitting New York with 2-3 trains there, if that's what you're aiming for. And then this tile here is not really ever laid here unless someone makes a horrible mistake overbuying into the Ninny, and then they're getting 4 2s dumped on them. But this tile is the most important one for the C&O. And the C&O is, a really attractive early game company, like I said, because it runs for 7. And it has the ability to kind of keep the New York New Haven in check. And this is a really important tile for the New York New Haven because this gives them the ability to run north and south New York when New York gets upgraded. If that happens, that's terrible. If you don't have, if you let that happen as a C&O player and you don't have the Ninny as well, that's a really, really tough thing to overcome, because that's super powerful, being able to run that track. So generally, the C&O has the ability to curb this by laying this tile here, either in this way that's kind of nice for the Erie, or in this way that's not as nice for the Erie. I mean, it doesn't really come into play a lot, but this is worse, definitely worse for the Erie, because there's no way out. So this is a really important tile to make sure that it gets laid, rather than one of the other double dits if you're not going to be a president of the Ninny. And then finally, just to talk briefly about the last of the early game companies, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Obviously, the most important thing that people will start the Pennsylvania Railroad for is the fact that it's only needs 5 shares to float. However, it only runs for 3 because Altoona is only at 10. And then if you buy a second train, you're only running for 6, which is less than the C&O with 1 train. However, it is pretty much guaranteed a Lancaster token. I mean, there's a possibility that it could not happen, but Lancaster here tends to be the most important token on the map generally. Access to this 00, access to New York this way if it gets upgraded from Reading and Allentown. So has the possibility of double tapping New York that way. So that tends to be a pretty important, hotly contested spot. That's probably C&O's Achilles heel in the mid to late game, is if the B&O starts and gets the Lancaster token before the C&O is able to get it when it's upgraded to green. That really hurts the C&O president in the mid to late game, because they'll be tokened out of New York. And granted, they have Chicago, but not being able to potentially double tap any of those areas that are getting quickly developed by two companies is a real problem for them. So that's pretty much all the information that I can think of to talk to you guys about up until the private buy-in. The next video will cover the mid-game floating second companies, the complications of that, potentially when to take control of companies that have been dumped, dumpster diving, holds, things like that. So I hope you found this video helpful, and until next time.